Okay, so I've pressed down my dart on the inside, so the seam allowance goes down. And I have serged the side seams of my front piece, so both sides, and then both of the side seams on my back piece. Now, I know not everyone has a serger. I've got you covered. I've got a few other alternatives for you. But the reason I included the steps to serge in my patterns is because when I first got a serger and I was so excited about using my serger and making sure I had nice finishes on all my garments, I had to really rethink how to put the pattern together. I couldn't just always follow the instructions in the pattern, because depending on when I was going to serge, like for example, I've serged this now so that when we sew the seam together, you can press it open. Whereas before I was sewing the seam and then serging the seam shut, and so I couldn't press it open, and I had to just rethink how I sewed my pattern. So I've included the serging steps in my pattern so that if you do have a serger, you don't need to go back and rethink the construction of my patterns. It's already in there for you. So as an alternative to serging your side seams, you can use bias binding. And I love bias binding. I use it all the time in my sewing. I have it, I'll try that again. I use it in some of my patterns as well. Like you'll see how I finish inside of waistbands and around a fly, or sometimes like inside the facing around a top. I'll use bias binding. So bias binding is really nice because it's going to enclose your seam. You only need your sewing machine. You're just going to be doing a straight stitch to put the bias binding on. You can buy bias binding, but you can also make bias binding out of scraps, which is what this fabric is. It's a scrap. I won't do a tutorial on bias binding right here in this video, but the size, off the top of my head, it's not the biggest size. I use the size down. Now with the bias binding, you'll notice that it's folded in half, but one side is shorter than the other. And you can just see here that that cream side doesn't come all the way up to the green. So that's the shorter side. This is the top side. So the longer side's going to go underneath and the shorter side will go on top. So I'm going to bind my side seams on my top in this binding. For your facing, I wouldn't put it on your facing that goes on the inside. I think it's going to end up too bulky if you bind the side seams and the facing. I mean, you can do whatever you would like to do, but for this example, I'm just going to do the side seams. So I'm just going to cut the binding a little bit longer than my side seam. I'll just cut a second length while I'm here. And I don't pin this on because it can stretch a little bit because it's on the bias as you sew, and I like to keep checking as I sew that, so when I open it up, sorry, I'll go back one more step too. This is double fold bias binding. So bias binding single fold looks like this. You've got the outside edges folded in, and then double fold bias binding is like this. And so I'm going to open that and put the edge that I'm sewing inside, and I want to get the edge of my top right into the center of the binding. And then I just fold it down. Okay, so I've just got my bias binding on the top edge there, and I just, like I said, opened it up, pushed the edge in. I've got my needle down so that I can see what I'm doing, and I'm just going to keep opening up the bias binding and putting the edge in, making sure it's sitting in there nicely, and just holding that flat while I sew that 1 to 2 mil in from the edge here. And I know it's catching the back side of the binding because it's longer. So like I said with the pins, I just found that because it can shift around the binding and stretch a little bit, that I'd have to do the same process anyway. So I was just better off not using pins and doing it this way. But if you prefer to use pins, you do whatever's comfortable for you. there's my binding. Okay, so I have sewn my side seam. I've just done one side to show you, at 0.5 centimeter seam allowance, and I have already pressed this flat, the seam there, and folded it back over itself again. So now my top is right sides together, and I've just pressed all this so it's nice and clean and crisp. Now I'm going to sew a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And when that's done, from the outside, you won't see any raw edges either, and you'll just have a nice finished seam. So remember, the pattern includes a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. We've sewn 0.5 centimeter already on that first seam, wrong sides together. Now we're going to sew the remaining 1 centimeter seam allowance. So there we go. I have finished my seam. This is the inside. It's clean, it's neat, it looks nice. And here is my seam from the outside. So it looks just as normal. And I'm just going to press that seam forward to the front and do my other side.